Oh, and apologies, sorry, one final thing just to say, the meeting will be recorded. So Felton, if you could just start that there, if everybody could accept that, please, so just so we can share the information with people who couldn't come along this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Janis. So I start this presentation, and we share the presentation between ourselves in different parts. Let's just start by saying that this was part of the European project, so it's a teamwork that has been ongoing for the past 3 years. It was financed by the European Commission, who actually was interested on revealing fairness characteristics and how they influence women as a user and as employee in the transport sector. In fact, these are some of the research questions that we were asked to address. The key factors affecting women travel choices, how relevant they are in discriminating between different transport choices and modality, and also the job characteristics and contextual factors that affect female employability and the career choices. In this presentation, we'll be focusing, therefore, on the case study that we had and in relation to railway, light rail, and public multimodal transport. We must say that we didn't do this in all countries in Europe and for all type of service provider. It was a pilot study that we were able to run in 3 countries and for 3 service providers. So one in Ireland, in Dublin, one in Barcelona, and one in Warsaw. There were also other case studies in the project. And we can also say that at the beginning, we started with revising the state of the art and some focus group to which some people even in Dublin took part in trying to categorize what are the emerging themes. And then when we speak about fairness for transport, what do we mean? What are the different categories of fairness characteristics that we can consider? And yes, it came out, there was an element of accessibility of the service in terms of physical accessibility, but also in terms of economic affordability, and the element of the design of the infrastructure, and then safety and security in terms of characteristics that would influence women's choices. We started by doing a sort of a survey that was mainly online to elicit different aspects. There will be, for instance, there would be, let's say, a reason of concern for some women in currently. And so we found overcrowding, emergency situation, harassment and pickpocketing, service availability and efficiency, universal design, cleanliness and maintenance as being an element for women in general, in the general population. However, when we talk about women traveling with dependent, we found the element of even physical accessibility, it was still considered to be a concern. And obviously for women with the low income, the fares and the availability of different ticketing options was considered to be an issue. We had to say that in doing this data at the beginning, we did it during the pandemic, but mainly before, we were able to identify also stations for which we wanted to do a face-to-face set of interviews, even just to be able to in a way, to see what the population that we were interviewing were. And in selecting the stations, the stations were selected also on the basis of a listing, definitely in Barcelona and Warsaw, in terms of demographic and GIS characteristics. So some of them in the lowest quintile of density of population and proximity to point of interest, and some of them in the highest quintile, like, you know, in Barcelona, Plaza de Catalunya is in the heart of the city, so it's the main city center, if you like, to make sure there were enough heterogeneous and they offer a different view. And in a sense, we also decided to establish some ground truths in terms of observation on those fairness characteristics. So in terms of the accessibility, what was noticeable in terms of accessibility, affordability, element of safety and security. And we rated them in terms of the surrounding area, concourse level, platform carriage level. And then we decided to move on the user satisfaction survey or questionnaire. we translate them in different languages, and we were able, as I said, to ask them face to face, but also to ask them sample remotely. And in fact, actually, some of you guys even address some of those questionnaires online or answer them for the case of the use of public transport. And in that sense, that's why I want to invite Mary to speak about some of the descriptive statistics and some of the insights we gain from the quantitative analysis of the responses that we gather from those. Mary.
Thank you, Chiara. So one of the elements, so you saw there, we collected data in a number of different ways, and one of the data sets that we collected was user satisfaction questionnaires. So I'm going to discuss some of the differences we found now between men and women and other groups based on their experiences in 3 locations. So as Chiara mentioned, we collected data in mainly Dublin, Ireland, Barcelona, Spain, and in Poland. So just to give you an insight to some of the data we collected, they were generally actually very consistent across all 3 sets of data. In Ireland, we had a good mix of men and women, and we also had non-binary and those who didn't wish to say about their gender. And the ages ranged obviously from 18 years to above 75 years were included. Similarly, in Spain, we had more women than men, but and also 10 non-binary and a good range of ages as well. And in Poland, we had 472 users, 196 males, 237 females, 6 non-binary, and 1 person who was a transsexual male, and 32 preferred not to say. We also found the majority were white. In the Irish sample, they were actually the biggest group was actually single, heterosexual, with no dependents, and didn't travel with dependents on a weekly basis. So that wasn't really surprising because we did collect data mainly at commuting times and commuter spots. In the Spanish data, there was the largest sample were married or in a stable heterosexual relationship. The majority of the sample was heterosexual, did no dependents well, and didn't travel with dependents on a weekly basis. So again, quite similar. And similar again in Poland. They were mainly white, married, straight, heterosexual, with no dependents, and didn't travel with dependents on a weekly basis. So we can kind of see that it's important to note this just for intersectionality and other groups and accessibility, that, you know, the majority of the sample generally tended towards kind of typical commuter workers that were traveling. Next. So just to kind of, I'll have to explain this a little bit more. So as mentioned previously by Chiara, there's 3 main areas that we kind of identified from the literature and the focus groups that we kind of used to think about our data and how we analysed it. And this was basically accessibility of the service in terms of the travel purpose, the capability of, you know, the design or the infrastructure to meeting people's needs when they were travelling, and of course safety and security. Now, when we gave this questionnaire, we asked people to rate their satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 7. Now, you'll notice here, this looks a bit strange. There's minuses and all of this weird and wonderful stuff. So what we decided to do in our analysis was we wanted to see how different things were between men and women. Now, as noted previously, we did have people who were non-binary, of different genders. Unfortunately, for each site, their numbers were too small to be able to do a reliable analysis with. But we do look at them all together later on in the presentation. So for now, I'm just looking at men versus women. And what we look at is the differences here. So you'll see here that it says negative D, Cohen's D, which means women higher than men. So if it goes below the line, it means women were more satisfied. If it's above the line, it means men are more satisfied. Now we'll see here when we're looking at capability, which basically is about how, you know, what are the capabilities of the service to meeting the needs of the user? You know, how is the system designed to meet their basic expectations, and is it environmentally sound? We generally found that there wasn't that much differences across the different sites or between the genders, except for in the Irish sample, women were very satisfied with ticketing, timetabling and route planning on site devices. We can see there's some differences here maybe in the Polish data where men were more satisfied and that they felt it fulfilled their daily travel needs and that they could easily travel to their workplace, but it wasn't significantly different, but so not that much of a difference between the genders when it came to capability. Next. Now, when it came to accessibility, there was generally, they were again consistent, but there was still some differences depending on the site. So when we talk about accessibility, what we're trying to measure is users' ability to access activities and services that people value, whether these are accessible to all groups in terms of design, comfort, but also in terms of fares and costs, and people with caring responsibilities or with children or with chronic illness or from lower socioeconomic status. So we can see here there is two significant differences here. In one, we see that men were much more satisfied, and in this, it was actually the more significant one was the Polish data. So we found that generally men felt more comfortable with the air conditioning in the stations and in the carriages. And then we see in the Irish data, women felt more satisfied that they could easily get to their destination from the station by walking or other means of transport. Overall, here we can kind of see that men are generally more satisfied with accessibility than women. It's marginally different in most cases, but we can see, say, with lighting in the station, men were much more satisfied in Spain and in Ireland. Not significantly so, but it is showing a trend that exists. Interestingly, so then we look at, no, that's fine. Next, sorry, Chiara. So the most consistent differences that came out, unsurprisingly, were to do with safety and security, where we can see that generally, except for a very minor exception there, men were generally more satisfied with their safety and security in the train stations or around them than women. And we see some significant differences. So the most jarring one is the first question here. Across all three sites, when arriving or leaving to the station, I feel safe at any time of the day. So in this, men were much more satisfied than women. So that's it. We'll see it again across the groups that this seems to be the most dividing factor. We also see about whether they felt confident about whether they could evacuate the station in an emergency or not. We see that this is more telling in the Irish and in the Polish data. But across the board, we can see that, whether they felt safe with their belongings, CCTV, and coming and going from the station, generally men felt safer than women. Next. We also examined, obviously we want to talk about intersectionality, and I could talk about it all day, so I'm only giving this kind of as a sample. We also looked at different groups and profiles. So we looked at people with chronic illnesses, and generally what we found with, this is NR's Northern Region. In the Irish data, there was really no significant differences across the different themes, the three different groupings. In Spain, we found that people with chronic illness were less satisfied with provided travel information. They felt less comfortable at the stations and in carriages and regarding air conditioning. And they also felt significant difference for safety and security issues like feeling safe, their belongings, and whether they could actually evacuate or not. There was generally significant difference across the board for those in Eastern Europe, in Poland, and they were less satisfied, especially with accessibility to stations. Dependents, those with living with or travelling with dependents, there were significant differences for those in Ireland. Those respondents living with dependents and travelling with them were less satisfied across all themes and across several statements, unsurprisingly. In Spain, again, it was similar that respondents travelling with dependents versus not were dissatisfied with the announcements and information provided. And in Eastern Europe, or Poland, people travelling with dependents and living with dependents were less satisfied across, again, a number of statements, but in particular with signage, travel, value for money and design. So there is some cultural differences regarding where we might have certain free travel. They didn't exist in other countries, and that had ramifications. We also asked a question of people who felt that they'd ever been discriminated against when they were using transport or working in transport based on their appearance or how they looked. So quite a broad question. And generally we found that across all three groups, there was general dissatisfaction. And as we'll see later on, non-binary respondents in this group reported greater discrimination. Next. So as I said, we kind of looked at the different data, but in some cases, it's sometimes better to have an overall view and to combine them all together. So what we can see here is that the Spanish sample is generally more satisfied than the other two areas, except for around the question of travel ticketing. But we can see that the Irish and Polish sample were typically in alignment for most of the questions. Next. When we look at gender, unsurprising, as I've shown earlier on, there wasn't that much difference between men and women with capability and accessibility, but the bigger differences emerged around some of the safety. But in particular, the even greater differences emerged for non-binary people. So we could kind of look at it when we had enough numbers. They're generally more dissatisfied than any other group by gender of these three. And it was around comfort, ventilation, comfort in space, and around safety measures. Next. So then when we looked at people who had faced discrimination based on their experience, generally they were the same except for, again, comfort issues and safety and security. Next. We also looked at those with chronic illness, and generally found that those with chronic illness or disability were dissatisfied in a number of different areas, and generally around accessibility to the station, safety, seating, comfort with space. All of these came up as issues. Next. When we look at these correlated together in regards to different issues around satisfaction, we find that there's certain things that are coming up from these three sets of data, and mostly around safety issues and accessibility issues. So we see almost every factor of safety, like getting help, evacuation, safe belongings, CCTV, and then seating, accessibility, lighting, announcements, all of these different things come into play. Next. So we looked at some of the overall travel satisfaction, and as I've highlighted before, there are differences between different groups. Just to give you a broader indication of what we looked at, we found that these different sections or profiles also differed in their travel significance, whether it was by ethnicity, religion, caring responsibility, education level, income, and by environment we typically mean whether they came from an urban, suburban, or rural background. So when we looked at the different factors regarding travel satisfaction, a few jumped out at us, which were, easy, whether it was easy to get to the destination, frequency of services, operational hours, travel information, value for money, being able to walk to or from the station, caring responsibilities, and what environment they were from. So whether you were traveling from an urban, suburban, or a rural environment. Next. So that's the kind of quantitative analysis around the user satisfaction from these three sites. I'm going to hand over now to Ajeni, who is going to talk more about the thematic analysis about the focus groups and interviews. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. So I'm going to move on to the thematic analysis of focus groups and interviews. And with this, I'll be touching upon an overview of the raw data that was collected, and then followed by outcomes of explorative analysis, as well as the metric comparisons that allowed for the revision of the fairness characteristics. Chiara, next, please. Cheers. As previously mentioned by Mary and Chiara, we collected data from the likes of Ireland, Spain, and Poland. So the table we're currently looking at shows a breakdown by ages and of interviews and focus groups that were being carried out. So we see interviews being carried out in Ireland, and then focus groups for Poland and Spain. With the selection of so for the focus group, we kind of focused on the area where we allowed participants. We collected pardon me. For the selection of participants, gender, and focus group, this was adopted where it was only female data. Collection from female participants was being made, or being adopted in order to allow a room or allow space or condition that allows a free discussion for participants within the areas of exclusion for women within the public service. Next, please. So on the current slide, our collection comprised of mostly women, as seen on the slide. A large percentage of the interview was being held in Ireland. A large percentage of the interviews that were being held in Ireland comprised of majority women in comparison to men. We also saw that a large percentage of the data being collected were from samples living in urban areas, leaving the lower percentage to the suburban areas as well as rural areas. We also keep in mind that a high amount of the responses we got from Ireland were from the populace that live in the urban vicinities. For the Ireland, or should I say for the samples being collected from Ireland as well, majority of the ethnicities were seen to be white, leaving only about 32% to that of minorities. Next slide, please. Okay, we carried out analysis that showed persistencies in data following that of prior themes that were seen grouped as accessibility of the service, infrastructure of the design, and as well as safety and security. With this, we began to see reoccurrences being highlighted, for example, the likes of accessibility of service as that of traveled and wayfinding information, being a factor of concern, service availability and efficiency, integration, walking times, transport access points, and travel ticket options and fares. With infrastructure and design, we saw the likes of cleanliness and maintenance, furnitures, and then the improvement on ventilation, especially given the existence of COVID, or even prior to COVID, yes, but with COVID, it was protruding more from the data itself. With safety and security, we saw issues of visibility of the surrounding areas being mentioned, overcrowding, personal space, and then lastly, harassment. Next slide, please. Through the analysis, or during analysis, there were all of these listed emergent themes were being prompted from the analysis of the interview data. We saw particularly high flagged frequencies, or should we say themes, being linked to the likes of convenience of the travel system and process, the need for gathered security or staff being present or around the area itself. And then we also saw the likes of high occurrences protruding from emergent themes as likes of intervals of operational hours. Within these, we found that approximately 60% of the data being coagulated from the emergent teams were derived from female participants, and as well as people who were living in urban vicinities. Next, please. On the current still progressing on the analysis, we realized that some of the reasons for, or should we say, some of the barriers affecting participants' use of public transport included the likes of the convenience of the service itself, cleanliness, crowd, timeliness of the service as well. But in a nutshell, we're going to see that the use of the service was being linked to the likes of convenience of the service, yes, comfort, yes, all of which play into that whole atmospheric, allowing the service to promote that sense of place when it comes to using the service. When it comes to the use of the service. With public transport, we began to say, okay, in terms of the factors affecting participants' use of public transport, these were noted into 3 areas where we could say, okay, it was linked into the influence of access, the influence of the environment itself, and the influence of the security, all of which influence or tainted, or should we say, all of which influence the behaviors of the users, whether it came to the likes of constrained travels, modal choice, or mitigation approaches that were being used. In terms of environmental influences, we saw the likes of visibility of the surrounding areas, the likes of graffitis. You begin to say, okay, the likes of the seclusion as well as segregation of facilities. In terms of access, as noted earlier, these were linked to the location of the service, the frequency of the service, the access of the service itself, all playing in a part and as a whole. Then lastly, safety and security, where these included, yes, the presence of staff, the need for security, or should I say technological measures that assisted security within the service itself, as well as overcrowding. Though these were factors that affect women use of public transport, we found within the data that particular factors were kind of interrelated, where we saw environmental factors, security factors playing into environment playing into that of access, and vice versa. Next slide, please. With moving further in the analysis or the thematic analysis, we did a metric comparisons of the barriers and needs in the three areas of access, security, and infrastructures and infrastructural design. Through the coding, we noted high occurrences, especially when it came to barriers of accessibility, as the likes of the convenience of the travel system, operational hours, service availability, ticket options and fares, and travel and wayfinding information. These can be seen as the barriers all the way for that of infrastructure, safety, all the way down. So we see safety being highlighted or protruding as that of harassment, visibility, overcrowding, etc. But through analysis, we noted that some of the needs that were protruding from this in terms of accessibility was convenience, operational hours, travel and wayfinding information. In terms of the infrastructure, we saw the likes of universal design. And then lastly, for safety and security, we saw the need for, yes, security personnel was being highlighted, as well as the visibility of the surrounding area of the station. In terms of the barriers and needs of safety and security, we also saw that these took to the top of the chart for both male and female participants, followed by the likes of accessibility and then infrastructure. Yet we begin to see that for our female users, there was a high need within this, there was high need for infrastructures in comparison to accessibility. Then regardless of, we began to see that a high percentage is being seen as a barrier for those not living within the, with dependents, as they rated safety and security as the top of their list, as then followed by accessibility, then lastly infrastructure of the service itself. Next, please. On our current slide, we kind of looked into insights across the data that was being collected from both Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And some similarities we begin to see, or we saw within the data, was where we begin to see there was special support that was being needed for different stages, for women at different stages of their lives. We also saw the need for frequency, which was being affected by COVID. There was also concerns of safety, regardless of locality, although these varied within nations. In terms of usability, participants tend to use the service similarly, or use service for similar reasons. There was noted insufficient parking spaces, regardless of location as well. Traveling or should we say traveling to or within suburban areas was noted as inconvenient, especially when looking at the likes of routes or the likes of schedules. We also noted similarities in terms of crowd when it came to rush hours, or tickets that were being made available for when people were changing or interchanging between different routes, as well as the cost, inconvenience of infrastructures, and then initiative for quiet carriages. And to finish up on this, we saw in terms of differences, the likes of, let's say, Ireland. Now Ireland, we began to see, and Poland, we saw an overall perception of the public transport was more an overall perception of public transport for Spain was more positive in comparison to that of Ireland and Poland. Old knowledge, or should we say, perceptions were being tainted for that of Ireland and Spain, perceptions were being linked to old information or old knowledge or myths of the transport system itself. We also noted the likes of, for Ireland, affordability and expenses reasons being highlighted, and some barriers in Ireland were noted as the likes of social images, and then lastly, better in terms of security. We saw that data was highlighting better perception of security for areas for the transport system in Spain in comparison to that of the Irish service. I'll leave this here and then hand over to Chiara. Thank you.
Jenny. So in general, it's interesting because it was a mixed method approach, because we became fully aware that by doing the survey at the station, we were interviewing the sample that were the users, and lacking the view of the people that were potentially non-users and for valid reason, and therefore collecting the data about why, if they weren't using the public transport, why was that and what problem they encountered. Among which also, when we talk about lack of accessibility, we're not talking about the rural area in Ireland that we know are lacking services effectively for public transport in many areas. But we're also talking about people in Dublin, where the system is still focused towards work commute type of journey, so connectivity towards the centre rather than around the centre, in lack of connectivity of places of interest when the mobility is not for work commute reason, but for instance, for mobility of care reason. In any case, what we notice is that fairness is a characteristic that is actually very important in terms of the user satisfaction of their experience of public transport. And it's, as we know, public transport is an enabler for fairness and inclusion in societies. And in many cases, and the women are, in many cases, and even in our sample, are the majority of users. So, in fact, women tend to use public transport more, maybe in different time of the day than men, and they also complain about the lack of availability of services for Ireland outside certain times. But in general, we thought it was interesting to see how fairness can become a characteristic that need to be assessed. So when we do, if you consider that many companies already do user satisfaction questionnaire, we thought it could be very useful for them to consider those characteristics as part of the elements that are evaluated. So we came up with this idea that a fairness maturity is a characteristic that can be assessed and benchmark against different service provider organizations across Europe, and why not even beyond that. And the main three themes were, let's say, assembled after the thematic analysis were capacity to meet the basic required needs. So the location where they need to get through the basic expectation, the accessibility aspect, and then the safety and security. And we thought, okay, to really evaluate those aspects, you need observable variables, the ground truths, and we found it was interesting especially for the Polish sample, where the regulator of the public service went out and did the audit themselves, and they came back saying, okay, these are the scoring, but more importantly, we were directly engaged in actually seeing the situation as it is on the ground, and we probably got, because of that, we got a complete different perspective than what we would have had by just looking at the statistics, let's say. And then we have the user perception and satisfaction, which is the survey that we did. And then we decided that they need to be a self-audit for management. That is a sort of a distilled version of the survey that was quite long, to highlight out of the thematic analysis and out of the analysis that we did in terms of factor analysis of the quantitative data collected, the key elements they could be rated. And in rating them, then you can potentially, depending on what percentage of score you get beyond the let's say the average, you can characterize an organization as being emerging or inclusive. And it could be a badge of honor. It could be the same type of things that we do for quality maturity modeling, or they can become something on which organizations can evaluate themselves. As Peter Drucker used to say, walk, get, measure, get done. And we thought, if we're serious about this, we probably need to find a way of assessing it. And we also develop a so-called Bayesian belief network. And I'll try and explain what that is. So it's a it's an AI algorithm, if you want to rephrase it in a different way, but pretty much it's a way of organizing the data to see in a graphical form how they tend to influence each other in terms of probability, or if you like, or likelihood of scoring. And the grouping was actually done on the basis of this method. And we found the travel satisfaction was strongly influenced by traveling information provision became a key characteristics that have very strong capacity of prediction on travel satisfaction. We also considered geographical data, structural data, and demographic characteristics. But we said, okay, meeting travel need became and is along travel information. Another aspect, safety and security, as we said, was the feeling safe. It's a basic need. It's something that needs to be satisfied. And then accessibility as well. So as you can see, meeting travel needs is the most relevant alongside accessibility and travel information. So this is the, if you like, up here, is the value of information, we call it, in terms of prediction of travel satisfaction. So it's all the things that we have considered are relevant characteristics. And therefore the so-called management self-audit became a toolkit online. And the distilled version of the characteristics we were able to distill out of the analysis that we did and customize for the use cases became an online freely available tool that organization can use to rate their own the service provision that they provide and see how well they score in respect to their capacity of being inclusive. We have recommendations. I don't know if we want to go through them. That came out of the project. Some of them came not just from the survey, but from the interview, where it was also possible to interview people that were potentially non-user. And yes, improve the coordination between timetable, service mobility for care journey, improve response time of security personnel to any incident. But sense of place, as you saw from the analysis that Ajeni did, sense of place is a barrier in the sense that the lack of sense of place is a barrier, but the possibility of having a good sense of place, it doesn't necessarily, yes, security guards, but not necessarily. It could just be staff, just having people around. So in the area where we go towards autonomous system, we heard loud and clear from people that they still want to see and have people around. So it's an interesting finding. And then we found also some of the things related to autonomous driving that will become an option, especially when if the autonomous vehicle can become a shared vehicle for providing, especially for providing access to areas where maybe the public transport is not as present or as available. Then we looked at other aspects in terms of bike sharing and women as employees that are also very relevant. As we said, the women as employees seems maybe a different use cases than the women as users, but it's not. If women are also involved in the planning and design of transport system and in the delivery of the service, that changes the services. It changes the sense of place, and it changes also effectively the choice that are being made and the priority that is given to certain characteristics and certain aspects of inclusivity that we know of and that we saw. So we want to thank you for your patience in listening to this presentation of what we learned so far. We want to leave you with some of the reference for the website where you can download. We wrote a white paper for the EU that is available to be downloaded for everyone on the summary of the findings that we presented. But we are happy to get questions now if you want to drill more into what we found for Ireland specifically, if that is within your interest. So we're looking forward to listening from you now.
Thank you very much to our three speakers this evening. So we'll go through some questions in the chat. So we had a question in relation to, as the study was only light rail, not necessarily applicable to all public transport, it would be interesting to assess women's views on safety on bus public transport, given presence of the driver. Have modes been compared, and does it make any difference?
It's not part of the official study, but we did get a sample on Dublin bus, and we did get a sample on the Luas. And there was a significant difference between the red line and the green line in terms of safety and security, at least in terms of perception, which has improved from the time we did this. So we did this exploratory study and focus group at the beginning of the project more than 3 years ago. The situation has now improved in terms of the perception for the red line, because efforts have been made to the presence of security people on the red line is significantly more evident, and that has changed a little bit the sense associated with the accessibility, let's say the possibility of let's say disruptive behavior on the line that were frequent and observable by the users, unfortunately. In terms of the Dublin bus, it's the same. And we have seen in those 3 years, we actually seen a trajectory of the willingness to make a stand and make an improvement, even in terms of there is a new fleet. The new fleet has better characteristics in terms of accessibility. Was harder, you had to lower the platform. It was not that easy for people with disability to board Dublin bus before, and it's much easier now. We had some bus stops are less safe than others, and they often don't come with any consideration regarding the lights or anything like this. But however, after unfortunately some of the events that we observe in this country, both shelters for possibility of people to go indoor, recharge their phone, have better light fixture, and the position of them have been improved, at least in suburban and rural area in Ireland. So we have seen some steps in the right direction, and we also have observed the online survey was useful. So we get comments, for instance, on people that were commuter using the public bus, and I remember reading some of them, some young mothers saying, yes, I used to use a bus to go traveling to work. Cannot do it anymore because it doesn't really allow me for doing the mobility or care journey, which is, leaving the kids in the crash before going to work. That is not something easily done on public transport, unfortunately, still. So we still need to find a right mix. I say a right mix because potentially the solution is could be somewhere in the middle of multimodalities.
Thank you. We have another question. Does the panel see any role for technology to solve any of these issues, or is intervention on the ground required?
I can add on that.
Go ahead, Ajeni.
I would say for the future, technology plays a very big and important role. Number one, we start off by the fact saying that we are in the 21st century, so everything really has been, I would say to a large extent, most things are being not necessarily motivated, but are being catered to by technology itself. Now, when we begin to look at public transport itself, especially looking into the factors affecting users or the use of public transport, we see a particularly high occurrences for the issues of safety, whether it be for the qualitative aspect of it or the quantitative aspect of it. Now, when you look at safety being an issue, what particular aspect of safety is being noted by the participants themselves? We begin to see the likes of the need for response time, security personnel being present. Yes, as Chiara mentioned, it's less about the security, yes, more about presence of people. However, in reality, are people always present? Not necessarily, because you begin to say, okay, what about issues of people traveling in late hours, or people who walk a distance, or in or walk outside on the outskirts of town, or locations which are isolated or secluded at nighttime hours. So, but if you ask the question of, does IT play a key role in the future, the answer to that is yes, because when we begin to look at, when you're saying if we want to influence policy, the first and utmost part to look at, especially when looking at transport at the moment, at least in my opinion, they're all interrelated. There's no one above the other. However, the key is to look at that aspect that is highly influential at the moment, which is safety, and the influencing users of public transport, which is safety at the moment. For safety now, we begin to see the amalgamation of technological measures that allows like a merge between human and technology, really, not just technology itself, because we say the system has CCTVs and what have you, etc. However, you begin to see issues within the study coming out where participants are noting, yes, I see the CCTV, yes, I can acknowledge that they have, but the issue comes to, especially with safety, when I'm being attacked at that time when it happens, a CCTV only captures the incident rather than assisting with a response. Now, if we can, we're not saying change, there's no such as complete eviction of a situation, but it's more of that particular gap. How can we cater to it so that we improve the user's interest in the use of the service itself, whether it comes to the atmosphere of the service in line with safety, access, and the environmental, the convenience, as well as the comfort. I'll leave that there.
Great, thank you very much.
Can I cut in on this?
Please, thank you.
Some of the questions, actually, Cormac, thank you for some of your questions. They were very interesting. So the role of technology, the role that technology has to play is completely going to change completely the face of how we consider our commuting. For instance, you were talking about the Dublin Commuter Coalition. Commuting will change. So, for instance, at the moment we are a bit demonizing cars because we don't consider them to be a sustainable mode of transport. However, technology allows car to become a shared mode of transport. And as Cormac was saying, like the likes of go-car, the likes of autonomous driving that doesn't even require a driving license or an insurance, let's say. So for people with different, we'll see, but the autonomous vehicle will also change the infrastructure around the way roads are designed and planned significantly. However, this will also become potentially a mode of transport that can be inclusive, can be cater for mobility of care journeys. People that have issue using public transport or using bikes, even for the simple reason that they are not they don't have the possibility of using a bike or pedaling, okay? And that is something that is technology influence. And even, for instance, what you were saying about the go-car, that you have to return them in a specific location, while in theory, it's perfectly possible thanks to the technology and the developing in the sense of geolocation of the different cars and the marking or the position where they are to have a free flow, so that yes, you take it in one location and potentially you leave it in another, and that can actually satisfy the question of A to B type of journeys with shared vehicles that could be between different users. So that could be also a very interesting point. Yes, and when you talk about the dark station attack, why did it take 6 months? Can the technology made a difference there? I think the CCTV was there, and facial recognition AI is also a feature that can make an impact, but maybe it's not. Yeah, it wouldn't be the immediate use of technology I would go for. I like the transforming role it has in modifying the transport infrastructure and the possibility that we have, rather than just the punitive aspect.
I think as well that in our own discussions with industry and getting feedback on Diamond, and this was an international audience, it was interesting to note the idea around, transport police, these different, now there was a lot of discussion in our own groups and our focus groups and discussions and recommendations around the idea of transport police, and whether that would even be feasible for Ireland compared to other countries. But it might be a case of linking back to what Ajeni was saying about technology and its role. It's about, I think for us, it's about joint up thinking really, to have these things feed into each other in a more seamless way, so that when these incidents happen, there's more rapid response, or even we can use predictive technologies as well. Because as we've seen from some of the heat maps and data analysis and stuff, we can see when are the stations busiest, when will there be more people around, when will there be, when are these incidents happening, when can we log them and different things. And I think that technology definitely has a role, but as we've seen from our feedback as well, for a sense of security, you can't beat the in-person as well. And as someone who regularly commutes and uses Irish Rail, it's been great to see that since we've began this project, they've brought on the customer service reps who are going around and very personable, checking if everybody's okay, if everything's okay, and they're on the late trains as well. So it's been great to see that post-COVID. But yeah, no, it's definitely, and it's since we started this project, it's been amazing, not amazing, horrifying, I suppose, to see all of these incidences occurring, and it's become to the forefront of my mind, whether it's the Lewis or Rail and the Dart and stuff, that these instances are happening.
But there are good changes as well, like in technology again, like for instance, the leap card. I don't know, the personal ID could be a good idea. I have a personal ID because I'm a commuter. I have the commuter. However, not necessarily just that. What is happening now, for instance, in Dublin, like you have the sort of the common ticket. So there is a certain time. I don't know if you guys have observed it. So if you obviously you jump on the train and you take the bus in the same, let's say, space of 30 minutes, and you don't pay the same. Initially in Ireland, one thing that was very expensive was if I had to use the train and the Luas to get to my destination, multimodality was penalizing me big time in terms of fares. And now that has been addressed thanks to technology, because it's easy to recognize that the time I started my journey, where I started my journey, where I am, at what point of the journey I am, and therefore I can have this facilitation of having intermodality without having to be penalized in terms of paying double the price that I would get if I use only one mode of transport. That's a fantastic and very welcome change to observe.
Yeah, lots of agreement in the chat there. I'm going to use chair's privilege and ask a question myself, if that's all right. And apologies if I missed it in your presentation. Did you look into, or is there other research looking into women's views around, I suppose, their agency or the opportunity, their power to kind of affect policy change? Something as a coalition we have found challenging is in terms of engaging with women, in terms of coming onto the committee or even just the broader membership or getting engaged, because obviously, we want to be inclusive and representative, but it's something that as a coalition we have found challenging. So any insights that you would like to share in that regard? Thank you.
Mary can actually address this, but women.
Yeah, I suppose I'm the gender researcher. I find that interesting. I'm not aware of any research off the top of my head around like transport specific practices and policies. Generally, like I haven't seen any major differences in it. It might be around the area, the discussion of transport. So we often see, like my area is more about the employment end of women working in transport, and what we find is obviously if it's very kind of masculine typed industry, women often won't engage in that, or they might see, oh, I'm not suitable enough for that, or I don't know how to talk around that, or that might stop them putting themselves forward for committees and different things. But also it's work-life balance as well. So what we find typically is, stressing flexibility, but also the benefits, the goals that they can make, the difference that they can make for their families and for the greater good. It would be good to emphasize. Because they might say, oh, well, what can I contribute to this? What can I add? I'm not an engineer, or whatever background they may have had. So but that's very generic now. I'm not, that's just me and my gender research. My area is women in leadership, so that's kind of what I'm borrowing from now. But we typically, that's some of the stuff that can come up.
Janis, my other opinion, and it's correlated to what Mary just said, is that we observe time poverty is a relevant characteristic for women as users, as workers, and therefore as volunteers as well. Especially probably in the age group that you might be looking for, which is the worker.
Well, I suppose we're open to all women, or all people who engage in either public transport, walking, and/or cycling. So it's quite a broad church.
Volunteer you, but I think you can join them.
Thank you. I think we just had a query then. I know, Chiara, you've responded in the chat, but just for the benefit of other attendees, so I think we probably can't see the chat. There was a query around, are there any examples of cities where it's convenient for women to trip chain and where childcare responsibilities don't present a barrier to using public transport conveniently, and what can we do to support women in relation to continue to use sustainable means once they become mothers? So I know, Chiara, you've indicated there's some research from Denmark that you're going to find out, so we might share that afterwards.
A very interesting research from Barcelona, where they are trying to extend a flexible mode of transport for suburban area. So imagine women with children might move from the city center to areas where there are parks, schools. We see that in Dublin. I moved out of the city center when my kids were 5. Just I'm an example of that, exactly of that demographic. And in Barcelona, something similar has happened. So they moved to the suburb area, which are beautiful, but not very accessible in terms of the public transport. And the accessibility of public transport in Barcelona is better than ours here. And what they are devising is a sort of a shared car minibus that can collect the kids and do the school runs. And while the mothers can either go to work or go through with the same bus to the train stations or the closest tram or metro station where they can get into wherever they need to go. And that was interesting to see, because I think in rural Ireland we can probably do something like that, like share minivan, a mini bus that can be flexible, and using AI, it could be like an app. Like the same app that we use for booking a taxi can be used for booking shared vehicles like that. And would be very interesting, yeah. And right. Then I agree with Elizabeth on the commuter is too limited a term, and some women don't identify with that. Yes, because we are way more than commuter. In many ways, you're training all the time.
Yeah, it's something we've bandied about as a coalition, and it's so answers on a postcard. If anyone can come up with a more inclusive, attractive word, we're open ears. I'm conscious of time, and we've had some great discussion, and I just want to leave time for our new chairperson, Felgen Jose, to say a couple of words this evening just to close us out. But thank you very much to our 3 speakers, and also for all the discussion and engagement. And if you're not a member of the coalition, please join, and we'll circulate details to that. So over to Felgen.
Janis, we will.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you.